Hello everyone and welcome to a new video on my YouTube channel Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez and I am coming to you over YouTube from the city of Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And today I would like to talk about a book which was published originally in 1856 and written by the great Victorian writer Wilkie Collins, one of the most popular of the Victorian era in England, with works that are really well known and still read to this day, like The Woman in White or The Moonstone. But we're not going to talk about any of those. We're going to go back to the early years of his career as a writer and as a novelist, the year of 1856, when he wrote and published a novel that is not as well known, that is fairly obscure and forgotten sometimes, one called A Rogue's Life. And even though I know that I have 3 different editions of this novel, I haven't been able to find any on my shelves to show you, but in any case it's fairly easy to find, and I would like to recommend it to everybody out there. Several years ago, back in October of 2013, I read this presentation about Wilkie Collins' A Rogue's Life at a conference, the IOSSBR conference, the International Organization of Social Sciences and Behavioral Research, in Las Vegas in the state of Nevada, as I said, back in October of 2013. But back then, about 7 years ago, I wasn't taping or videotaping my conferences, my presentations, my academic papers, and so, you know, I really didn't have the chance to preserve it on tape. So what I thought was, since I have been able to find the original manuscript of that presentation, well, I thought that I would read it and record it today in July of 2020, right here on the front porch of my house in Jackson, Tennessee. And that's what I'm going to be doing on this video, and I hope you find it interesting, and I hope that it will lead you to seek out this novel by Wilkie Collins and read it, because it really is a very enjoyable book. The title of this presentation for the IOSSBR conference back in 2013 is A Self-Fashioned Criminal, Autobiography, Criminal Behavior, and Social Satire in Wilkie Collins' A Rogue's Life from 1856. So when publisher Richard Bentley offered Wilkie Collins the chance to revise the text of his short novel A Rogue's Life for publication in book form in 1 volume in 1879, Collins prefaced it with a brief foreword in which he makes an equally brief critical appraisal of the work. And he says, "The Rogue may surely claim 2 merits, at least, in the eyes of the new generation of readers. He is never serious for 2 moments together, and he doesn't take long to read." Like Collins himself, subsequent critics seem to have considered A Rogue's Life as a light-hearted novella, an example of the writer's early work that, despite its popularity when it was originally serialized in Charles Dickens's magazine Household Words in March of 1856, should be seen merely as an easy-to-read, youthful literary exercise. Collins also reminisces in a short preface about the circumstances in which A Rogue's Life was written. And he says, "The story offers the faithful reflection of a very happy time in my past life. It was written at Paris when I had Charles Dickens for a near neighbor and a daily companion, and when my leisure hours were joyously passed with many other friends, all associated with literature and art." Indeed, on the surface, the story in A Rogue's Life does seem to reflect that very happy time in Collins' life. It is a light-hearted story. Its plot seems erratic at times and takes many twists and many turns, and the abrupt ending of some of its chapters betrays its serialized nature, because of course Wilkie Collins needed to maintain the reader's interest in the story week after week, since the story was serialized in Household Words. But a more in-depth reading of the novel reveals that, at least thematically, it is more complex than one would think at first sight. Throughout the novel, as he has the main character, Frank Softly, give an autobiographical account of his life, Collins engages in a very fruitful intertextual dialogue with the traditions of the Spanish picaresque novel, la novela picaresca, and the British kind of rogue literature, both of which gained prominence around the same time in the 16th and 17th centuries. The various elements from these previous literary traditions that he incorporates into the novel, often modified and parodied, enable Collins to paint a vivid, highly visual, and eminently satirical portrait of the complex moral and social landscape of the 19th century Victorian urban milieu. Since, beginning with its very title, Wilkie Collins inscribes a rogue's life within the traditions of picaresque and rogue literature, let us first offer a brief panoramic account of the history of those two genres that are so closely connected, both from a historical and from a literary point of view. The Spanish picaresque lies at the very inception of the genre of the novel, in fact. Its very first example, Lazarillo de Tormes, was published anonymously in 1554. It would not be until 1599, though, that the genre would actually come into its own with the publication of Mateo Alemán's Guzmán de Alfarache, a much longer, much more complex work that, together with Lazarillo de Tormes, set the basis for the picaresque novel. This type of work, a picaresque novel, usually conceptualizes its main protagonist, a rogue, as a subject, allowing him or her, because some rogues are actually women, to narrate his own life story from a first-person perspective. Thus, the rogue becomes a vehicle for social criticism, his fictional autobiography exposing the ills and vices of contemporary society. Alemán's Guzmán de Alfarache became an instant bestseller and spawned two second parts, one by Alemán himself and another one by another writer, Luján de Saavedra, written without the consent of the original author, which was not uncommon in those days. The same thing happened to Cervantes in the case of Don Quixote, and the second part by Avellaneda. More importantly, Guzmán de Alfarache transcended international boundaries and was translated into several European languages, among them English. The English translation by James Mabb appeared in 1622 simply as The Rogue, and was met with such acclaim that the word Guzman entered everyday speech as a synonym of rascal, rogue, or criminal. Of course, today nobody says, hey, you're a Guzman, but back in those days, the work was so popular that the word Guzman became a synonym for criminal. And of course, the word Guzman comes from the English pronunciation of the name of Mateo Alemán's rogue, Guzmán de Alfarache. But the popularity of Mabb's translation of Guzmán did not occur in a void, and this is very important because the British Isles did already have their own tradition of literature about the underworld, in some cases predating the first Spanish picaresque novel, Lazarillo, and including such genres as the jest book, which was popular or had been popular since the Middle Ages, the rogue pamphlet, and the criminal biography. All of these genres are interesting in that, though the subject matter is very similar to the picaresque, in many cases the tone and the intention are radically opposed. For instance, rogue pamphlets seek to expose the rogue and his illegal tricks and cheats in order to warn as well as entertain the reader. So whereas the Spanish pícaro, the Spanish rogue, acts as the subject in picaresque novels, English pamphleteers such as Gilbert Walker, Thomas Harmon, and Robert Greene turned their rogues into objects to be criticized and vilified, often blaming them for the social and economic obstacles facing Elizabethan and Jacobean England. This is obvious even in the titles of these works. For example, Walker's manifest detection of Dice Play from 1552, and Harman's Caveat for Common Cursters, commonly called Vagabonds from 1566. Those are just two examples of these titles. The same can be said of the 17th century criminal biographies, which always use real criminals as their subject matter and largely fictionalize their lives in a double attempt to warn and entertain. Such is the case, for instance, of Francis Kirkman's The Counterfeit Lady Unveiled from 1673, an account of the life of a real-life criminal, Mary Carleton, that fictionalizes her life story for sensational effect. In many ways, these criminal biographies were a little bit like the tabloids of their time, and they were as popular back then as tabloids are or have been in our time. Going back to A Rogue's Life, as I mentioned before, when almost 200 years after the publication of The Counterfeit Lady Unveiled, Wilkie Collins chooses A Rogue's Life as the title for the fictional serialized autobiography of Frank Softly, he is consciously inscribing the work within these pre-existing literary traditions. Yet it is very clear from the beginning of the novel that, unlike most British rogue literature works, Collins is using Softly as a vehicle for seemingly light-hearted but very sharp social criticism. And in this sense, he is bringing in elements from the Spanish picaresque tradition. In the very first paragraph of the novel, Softly presents himself as, and I quote, an example of some of the workings of the social system of this illustrious country on the individual native, end of quote, and sardonically announces his intention, quote, to quote himself for the edification of my countrymen. Therefore, unlike the Spanish picaros, or rogues, who always took up the pen to explain the reasons behind their current state of dishonor, and previous English rogues who were flatly denied a voice, unlike them, Softly has an explicitly satirical agenda in the writing of his autobiography. Moreover, since he is writing in Australia, where the various events of his life have taken him, his memories are those of an outsider looking in from the outside, something which sets him apart from Spanish picaros, who were often outcasts within Spanish society, but writing in Spain and not in the New World. This spatiotemporal distance allows Softly not only to pick and choose the facts of his life that he is willing to write about, but also to represent himself as a criminal throughout the novel. And he chooses to fashion himself as a criminal, as Don Quixote, for example, fashions himself as a knight, embracing the literary conventions of picaresque and rogue literature, often overturning them for both comic and satirical effect. Following the typical structure of picaresque novels, Softly begins by relating his birth and parentage. However, unlike most Spanish picaros, who are born of lowly origins and whose parents are either poor or thieves or prostitutes, Softly admits that he is very well connected. I quote, I came into this world with the great advantage of having Lady Malkinshaw for a grandmother, her ladyship's daughter for a mother, and Francis James Softly, Esquire, M.D., for a father. This is, of course, Frank Softly speaking at the beginning of the novel. His situation is therefore more advantageous than that of, say, Lázaro in Lazarillo de Tormes, who was born on a riverbank and whose father was a thief. Indeed, even though Softly insists on calling himself a rogue throughout the novel, his self-representation as a criminal often contradicts the actual facts that he relates. And this is so because rather than an actual rogue, he is what we might call a literary rogue, a mask that he decides to wear in order to make his life story more attractive, as well as justifying some of the choices that he makes in the course of the story. Ironically, his position within the aristocracy of his time ends up turning him into a sort of outcast, in a similar way in which Spanish picaros are precluded from fitting into a social order that rejects the members of the lower social strata. But in the case of Frank Softly, this is so precisely because of his refusal to conform to the expectations that society has regarding those individuals born of noble origin. Horrified at the prospect of becoming a respectable doctor like his father, Softly wishes he did not have so many relatives in high places. And he says, driving about from place to place, living jovially at inns, seeing fresh faces constantly, and getting money by all this enjoyment instead of spending it. What a life for me if I had been the son of a haberdasher. End of quote. As we can see, Softly idealizes the way of life of the middle and lower classes, and his roguery is an activity in which he dabbles merely by choice, not because he has to do it, but because he chooses to do it. And yet, under the cloak of a rogue, of a wannabe criminal, Softly feels free to indulge in keen social criticism. Not only does he decry the fastidious obligations that fetter him as a gentleman, but he also abhors the public education system and the empty rhetorics of many members of parliament. Reminiscing about his day as a student in a fashionable public school, Softly facetiously reflects on the skills that he acquired there. And he says, I learned to play at cricket, to hate rich people, to cure warts, to write Latin verses, to swim, to recite speeches, to cook kidneys on toast, to draw caricatures of the masters, to construe Greek plays, to black boots, and to receive kicks and serious advice resignedly. Who will say that the fashionable public school was of no use to me after that? End of quote. With that funny question. The satire on Parliament appears later in the novel. This was the satire on the public education system. Now comes the satire, a little bit later on Parliament, when Softly is appointed secretary of a literary and scientific institution and is made to attend endless meetings aimed at organizing its opening ball. Something very interesting and very important, as we can see, the opening ball. Softly notes that the institution was, quote, torn by internal schisms even before it was open to the public. And he observes that it is governed by two factions, the Puritans, opposed to novels and dancing, and the more liberals, who are depicted as the opposite of that. Rhetoric seems to be prized over communication at these meetings, with the result that no agreements are ever reached, and the ball turns out to be a failure, prompting Softly's resignation. And he's pretty happy to resign, I think. While presenting himself as a criminal throughout the novel, only two of Softly's professional activities are actually worthy of being labeled as criminal behavior. Namely, his time spent as a forger of classic paintings and his activities as a manufacturer of counterfeit money. Those two definitely are activities that would be labeled as criminal. But we will see how they turn out to be. The latter, the manufacturer of counterfeit money, makes up more than half of the plot of the novel and will eventually bring about his downfall. Yet even in this case, his supposedly criminal behavior must be taken with a grain of salt, since he is forced into coining bad money by Dr. Dulcifer, quite the name, the father of Alicia, the woman with whom he falls in love and eventually becomes his wife. Upon the discovery of Dr. Dulcifer's illegal dealings, Softly is chased by the Bow Street runners, the detective police of the time, all over England, all over Wales, and all over Scotland, and finally apprehended, but not before he has the chance to marry Alicia at an inn. Not at a chapel, not at a church, mind you, but at an inn. At the closing of the novel, Softly is sent to Australia, as we mentioned before, as a convict. And here again, His gentlemanly origins will come in handy since he escapes capital punishment and eventually thrives as a businessman and becomes a very rich man in Australia. His wife, under the false identity of a widow, follows him to Australia, goes down under, and after his sentence is reduced for good behavior, takes him as a servant and winds up marrying him for a second time. This happy ending is significant in the light of previous rogue literature. Whereas the Spanish picaros and English rogues are always doomed to failure in their attempts to attain respectability, Softly is able to put an end to his life as a rogue. The novel thus ends abruptly because, as Softly himself claims, quote, "How can I, as a rich and reputable man, be expected to communicate any further autobiographical particulars to a discerning public of readers? No, no, my friends, I am no longer interesting. I am only respectable like yourselves." That's the end of quote. And again, the satire is very obvious in this final part of the novel. In this way, Softly perfectly summarizes both the reasons why readers are drawn to reading the exploits of rogues and the reasons behind his self-fashioning as a criminal. It is simply a mask. It is no more than a mask that liberates him from social responsibility and that makes his autobiography much more attractive to a larger audience of readers. And for that reason, in A Rogue's Life, Frank Softly is a literary rogue and not a real or true-to-life criminal. This is the content of the presentation that I gave in October of 2013 in Las Vegas at this conference. I hope that you found it interesting, and if you have any comments, if you've read this book, if you're interested in the literature of Wilkie Collins, make sure to leave a comment underneath the video, and I'll be very happy to read your comments and respond to them. This is Anton Garcia Fernandez saying goodbye from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. Mine is the copyright of this video, which was recorded in Jackson in July of 2020, although it is the content of a presentation that I originally wrote and presented in 2013. Thank you very much for your interest, and so long, everybody.